So as Julie explained, this project was partly funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Historic Environment Support Fund, and was essentially the compilation of a plan to inform a variety of stakeholders how best to go about conserving these burial grounds by assessing their significance and creating a guide to their future monitoring and conservation decisions. But first, if I can just have a look at, go through what I'm going to be talking about this evening. Firstly, I'm going to introduce the three sites and go through very briefly what we mean by a conservation management plan. Then I'm going to go through each of the three sites again in a bit more detail, identify their general background and history and what's been done in the past, as well as what we found out about the sites during our site survey. Then we can look at the significance of each site and identify its main issues that could cause problems in the future in terms of their care and maintenance. From there, we can start to think about the conservation approach we could take going forward. So without further ado, here's an introduction to the three sites, which are from north to south at Bride's Chapel, further up the A84 coming out of Callander to the northwest. Then there's Kilmahog graveyard closer to Callander in the small hamlet of the same name. Now, this site was originally a much larger settlement in the 19th century, but we'll come to that later on, as it's got a bearing on what we know about the site. And finally, there's Leny burial ground, located just outside Callander in a reasonably isolated piece of land on a floodplain, which goes a lot to explain why the chapel here was eventually abandoned in the late medieval period. But again, more on that later. So what did we do here? What was the overall aims of the conservation management plan? Well, in this respect, we were very much guided by the HES 2014 conservation plan guidance. And this slide is a very simplified approach to what is hoped to be achieved by the plan. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with them, a conservation plan or a conservation management plan, it's about assessing how and why a site or structure is significant and then finding a way to conserve that cultural significance for the future. This is usually done by working with landowners and a huge range of other specialists to achieve this. Now, most plans are done by conservation experts or consultancy specialists, but there's also input from a number of other specialists such as archaeologists, building surveyors, quantity surveyors, stone conservators, landscape specialists, and so on. Our plan was fairly simple in scope, and we aimed to look at what the defining significance of the three burial grounds were, and also then to determine the issues which faces them. From there, we can come up with a sound basis to move forward to the next stage of conserving the sites for the future. Now, one of the main aspects of the plan, which relates to outstanding structures, is having a basic understanding of the site, which meant an on-site topographic survey of each one, which also included a photographic and written survey, which AOC's building team completed in September last year. So, moving to our first site, we can start with St. Bride's Chapel, which is the northernmost of the three sites. You can see its location here, adjacent to the river, perched on the west side of the A84. It's basically a stone rubble walled enclosure, about 460 square metres with an entrance to the east. And St. Bride's Chapel is a scheduled monument, which pretty much means it's considered of national significance, known to house the remains of a 13th century chapel dedicated to the Bride of St. Bridget of Ireland. So let's look at the understanding of the site a little bit more. We don't really know much more than the existence of the 13th century chapel, although it is mentioned in a poem or canto called The Lady of the Lake, which I think is set in the 17th century, written by Sir Walter Scott. It was a really popular narrative poem of the time. Scott wrote it whilst he was travelling with his wife Charlotte in the Trossachs, so the region was at the very forefront of his mind. The poem basically centres around the struggle between James V and the Douglas clan. It is rather a bit of a tragic love story, but it was written when Scott was at the height of his fame And to put this into perspective, he sold 25,000 copies of it in 1810, which just sounds like a huge amount back then. It broke all the records for any sale of poetry that had come before it in Britain, apparently, and even became popular in America. There's an extract from it right here. I'm not going to try and butcher it with my obvious English accent, but this is the section that mentions St. Bride's Chapel. So we've got an important and significant link here, which we'll come to a little bit later on. But coming back to looking at the development of the site itself, the historic maps just really don't tell us much. Anything prior to the mid-19th century, it's just not large scale enough to show the buildings in any detail in these rural areas at least. So here, by the time of the first edition OS map, published in 1866, it's pretty much shown as an enclosure as it is today, marked as a ruin, and there's really no changes to the site in the subsequent maps. What we do know is that there were some excavations of the site in the 1930s, and very few records remain at all of this as far as I know. So I'm more than happy to see if anyone listening might have any more information on those digs. And there was also another excavation in the 1970s, or I've seen them referred to as a restoration, where the chapel outline was exposed, although of course this being 60 years ago, this is now overgrown once again. Right. So there might have been other interventions since that time, which again, by the local community, which people might have more information on, but bringing us back to 2021 and the topographic survey of the site. So let's have a look at that. So here we can see the enclosure wall, the photograph to the bottom right, showing what kind of height and state the wall survives in now. This is the wall that's adjacent to the road. You can just see how close it is. And on the top left, you can see a similar picture on the opposite side and also appreciate how close the site is to the river edge. In the top right, there's the entrance to the northeast corner through an iron gate, flanked by circular gate piers. And what we can presume is the remains of St. Bride's Chapel itself in the centre, excavated in the 1930s. Although now again very much overgrown. In the west end of the south wall, there's another opening with an iron gate with pointed railings, now sunken well into the ground, which you can see on the bottom left photo here. And to the west of the chapel are 3 grave markers, which are 2 slabs and an upright gravestone. And there's also a possible 4th grave marker or grave plaque in the south wall. So let's have a look at the graves. The 2 grave slabs are laid flat with no visible signs of legible text. And there's also an upright gravestone, which is dedicated to James McKinley, who died in 1805. And the grave also commemorates his wife Eleanor and son Peter. And what we can see here is a very elaborately carved stone, with the upper section having an angel decoration, whilst the back side of the stone has 2 rams to either side. Even the sides of the stone are decorated with a carved flower and an illegible Gaelic inscription. So that's our very quick overview of the site, and we can turn now to look at the significance of it. So, excuse me. Apologies for the wordy slide, but a thing to mention here again is that St. Bride's Chapel is a dedicated scheduled monument, and so is already considered to be of national importance, given its medieval origins. And up here on the slide, I'm not going to read it out, it's there for you to have a look at, but it notes why it has been afforded this significance. Mentioning also 2 cross slabs, one each found during the 1930s and 1970s excavations. But how can we define the specific significance of the site? And now to do this, we can look at various different categories of characteristics. The intrinsic characteristics, which is the physical remains of the site, the contextual characteristics, looking at the site in its context or setting, and the associative characteristics, which are looking at the sites and their association with people or groups or anything that really links the place to anything at all really that's considered important to anyone and how they might feel about the site. So let's start with the intrinsic, and of course, as well as the undated grave slabs and the remains of the chapel itself, There's the remains of the two stone cross slabs found in the 1930s and 70s. The slab that was found in the 1930s has also been dated to about the 11th century. So this implies an even earlier possible date for the chapel than the 13th century. Now, the fact that we also have an early 19th century gravestone shows evidence for the continued use of the site since that time, identifying that it was valued as a place of memorial for a very long time, right up to the 20th century, with the conservation efforts of the 30s and 70s, where the local community aimed to uncover what remained of the chapel. So now we can come to the contextual characteristics and how a place relates to its surroundings. Well, with St Bride's, Hess itself notes in the scheduling information that the positioning of the site on a mound adjacent to a river is near two Gaelic place names, which mean Ford of the Chapel and Crag of the Chapel. And this hints to a very early use for the site, with the naming of these places in relation to the chapel itself. And finally, we can look at associative characteristics and how the site relates to known people and society in general. Clearly, the most important of these is St Bridget, or St Bride herself, a depiction of her to the top right here. And she was Bridget of Kildare, who died in Ireland in the 6th century. She's well known across Scotland. The Irish saints were much revered here. We can also look at the significance of the site in the Romantic sense with Sir Walter Scott's poem or canto and how popular it was for the time. And of course, the McKinley family, with one of his descendants being the 25th president of America. That's 20 before Trump. This chap here, William McKinley, to the bottom right. So we've established the significance of St Bride's in a number of ways, identified the main important areas as to why it needs to be preserved. So what issues face the site? Well, the main issue appears to be the boundary wall, which was largely in fair condition, although there is a significant collapse to the east end of the north wall, the area which commemorates the 1930s excavations. Perhaps not the best bit of wall rebuilding back then, as we can see with the pictures on the top right here. There's the typical weathering of the gravestone and overgrowth of the grave slabs and the footings of the chapel, which were exposed in the 1970s and now are very overgrown. One of the consequences of this, knowing that the site has been in use from the 13th century, even possibly the 11th century, means that there may well be many more burials beneath present ground and vegetation. The gates themselves aren't in poor condition, although there are signs of rusting, and of course we can't ignore the location of the site adjacent to the river and the dangers of the erosion of the riverbank. So that, for now at least, concludes our understanding of St Bride's Chapel, its significance and what its main issues are in terms of how its future conservation might be tackled. So let's move on to Kilmahog graveyard. And here we have its location along a small track, again just north of the river in the small hamlet of Kilmahog. It has by far the largest number of burials at about 122, and it's all enclosed by a boundary wall, probably 18th century, with a nice grand entrance in the north wall, which you can see to the bottom right hand of the slide here. Now, this was the primary burial ground for the people of Kilmahog, which was once a much wider settlement than it is today, which I'll touch on later, and it's another 13th century chapel I dedicated most likely to St Chug. The 1866 OS map here notes the rectilinear enclosure with a mort house against the north boundary wall and another distinct structure, which is a large grave enclosure. So here we can see the topographic plan of the site. You can see the same enclosure with the main entrance to the west side through a wide arched opening, set within a gabled wall with a small rounded space for a bell. Now this is supposedly 15th century and bears the arms of the Graham family. And thanks to the Callander Heritage Society for the knowledge that this is Donald the Hammer's bell and comes from the shores of the Lake of Monteith, which was stolen in the 17th century and later moved around in payment of a debt, finding its way to Kilmahog in 1819. So that's a rich and varied history for just one small object, just there. And adjacent Adjacent to this, to the north side of the west wall, is another side opening as well with an iron kissing gate, which you can see at the bottom left-hand photo. Moving a little further along to the east is the Mort House, which I've annotated here, incorporated into the north boundary wall. It's got a small entrance to the west side, a pitched slate roof, as you can see from the photographs on the right-hand side of the slide. But what is immediately noticeable on the plan is the sheer amount of graves, just showing how much larger the settlement at Kilmahog was in the 18th and 19th centuries. There's also a large grave enclosure to the west side and a noticeable mound in the centre, which may be the remains of the former chapel. So what can we say about the graves? Well, as I said, there's about 122 grave markers in total that we can see, at least dating from the 18th century to the 21st century. So we can conclude that the site's been in constant use since then, although there are some possibly earlier grave slabs from the 17th century there as well. And many of these grave slabs haven't got any legible writing, haven't been weathered away long ago, or largely covered in grass or vegetation. Now, most of the upstanding graves are pedimented gravestones, and several of these have memento mori imagery on them, which is essentially the skull and crossbones, and an hourglass, which you can see in the top right-hand photo as an example. Other common symbology we're seeing includes the crest of the Clan Stuart, with multiple Stuart burials within the graveyard from the 18th century up to the 20th century. Now, as far as I'm aware, I think the Clan Stuart has no direct chief, and the Earls of Galloway are now considered to be the principal branch of the clan. There's also some granite obelisks and Celtic style crosses, generally a real mix of different grave styles, basically spanning over 2 centuries. The most dominant gravestone, however, is in the grave enclosure I mentioned to the west, which is even included on the OS map. And this is dedicated to William Macfarlane, and dates to 1851. And we can see a photo of that on the bottom right here, set on a large pedestal topped with an urn. Quite a grand edifice in comparison to the rest. So, just as we did with St Bride's Chapel, and having taken all this in, we can once again look at how this feeds into the significance of the site. So, unlike St Bride's, Kilmahog isn't scheduled, although it is a grade C listed structure. It was downgraded from a grade B in 2004 when it was reassigned to be more consistent with other known burials of a similar date. Therefore, the listing indicates that it's already been considered as having regional significance. When looking at intrinsic characteristics, we're clearly looking at the architecture on the site, including the imposing entrance, the Mort House, and of course the grave markers and gravestones themselves. The listed building description notes that there's a metal plaque in the centre of the graveyard marking the site of the former 13th century chapel, although the footprint of the foundations were described as indiscernible in 2004, although there is a slight earthwork, as we saw on the plan, which might allude to where this might have been. So we're looking again at likely buried remains, both the chapel and earlier burials at medieval grave markers beneath the ground. There's also a number of interesting graves on the site, including the plain but well-preserved gravestone to Flora MacNab from 1806, and several nice pediment gravestones as well, including the Macfarlane monument, of course. The walls are likely to be 18th century in date, and the Mort House might be 19th century. This would have been in use to house the dead on a temporary basis. And this ties in with the date of the body snatchers, which was a real threat in the 19th century. So lockable Mort houses aimed to house the dead until they were basically no longer fit for purpose. It's a relatively common feature, and we can see Mort houses in many burial grounds and churchyards of this period. So its survival here is an important relic of a specific burial tradition in the 19th century, which has been influenced by historical events. So moving on to the contextual and looking at the site within its setting, it's set on a raised area of ground between the road and the river near the settlement of Kilmahog, which itself is on the River Lake to the west of Callander and at the junction of the Trossachs and Knockernard roads. So it's in a fairly important position, And although it's only got a few houses here today, in fact, I think there were about originally 250 people or maybe 50 families working and living in and around Kilmahog in the 19th century. So let's have a look at some maps. Stobie's 1783 map shows a more substantial settlement and at least 3 mill symbols along a mill laid upstream from Kilmahog Bridge. And we can see this on the OS map of 1866 as well, which I've widened out a bit here. The graveyard circle to the west there, it's obviously a much more sprawling settlement with a graveyard fairly isolated. So we're looking at a much bigger settlement at Kilmahog back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it's clearly reflected in the number of graves and grave markers on the site. So finally, we're moving on to associative characteristics, and there actually seems to be some uncertainty as to who the original chapel was dedicated to, with suggestions ranging from St Kesog, St Mahog and St Chug, although St Chug appears to be the one that's been settled upon, with historians even attributing the name of Kilmahog to literally mean chapel at St Chug. But we at least know that it was in existence by the 13th century, as it's first mentioned in the papal registers in 1259. Now, the Mort House can also be associative, reminiscent of the body snatching era, which I mentioned a moment ago, which roughly dates from the 1750s through to the 1830s, when bodies would be snatched for sale to doctors and surgeons. There's a fairly dramatic reenactment here, which might be Birkenhair, I think, actually, but it gives you an idea of the very, very real fear that local communities had of this. Each of the gravestones, as there are so many here that do actually have a legible inscription, has got some historic association with a person who lived within the Kilmahog area. And genealogists and historians can use this information to draw a picture of who lived there, as well as many aspects of their lives. And of course, there's the McFarlane Monument, which was sculpted by Hugh Berkeley, who also designed a number of monuments in the famous necropolis in Glasgow. Hugh Berkeley, along with his brother David, he was an architect and sculptor. They were based in Glasgow and designed many schools and colleges in central Scotland in the 19th century, well into the Edwardian period. But they also did a lot of church-related work and obviously monuments and grave memorials. So as with some brides, what sort of issues are we looking at for Kilmahog? Well, the overall condition of the graveyard structures is good, and the Mort House is being repaired and repointed at some point, although the door is slightly rotten in places. The boundary wall is damaged in a number of places, and it's collapsed outwards, as you can see in the top left photo here, with a 3-metre length gone in the east wall. And there's also some damage to the south and west walls. So there's clearly some areas that require attention. There's the usual vegetation growth around the site, which is possibly causing some structural damage to the entrance archway. You can see small tree branches growing out of the stonework here in the bottom left, adjacent to the bell. Trees are also compromising some of the gravestones, as you can see to the bottom right, and their roots may well be displacing the human remains below the ground. There's the usual moss and lichen growth on the gravestones, perfectly demonstrated in the photo to the top right, where a particularly nice rounded gravestone is slowly being engulfed by moss. And of course, the weathering of the inscriptions is an issue that's only going to get worse. Most gravestones of the 19th century were made from sandstone because it was easy to sculpt and create elaborate inscriptions. But being such soft stone, they can usually wear away, become delaminated, something we can see clearly that's happening with the McFarlane Monument here, where the top of the inscription is slowly disappearing. There's also some issues to the entrance porch, where the gate has a temporary fix and yellow strapping, and there's other rusting to the side gate. And finally, there's the recumbent stones in the graveyard, which are slowly being engulfed by the growth of the vegetation and grass. There appeared to be recent mowing of the graveyard when we did our survey, as you can see on the right-hand side here, so there may be an issue of over-mowing or strimming on the site as well. So we've gone through Kilmahog as an asset, its significance and issues, just as we've seen with some brides. And if you're still with me, there's one final site to look at, and that's Leny burial ground, sometimes referred to as Little Leny. So here we are, this is the location of Little Leny. If we can think back to its situation much closer to Callander, it's on a section of raised ground within a wider floodplain. It was actually the main graveyard for the Buchanans of Leny. So here we have a burial site which is being used by a single family in the area and is centred around an east-west burial enclosure, which is thought to be built from the stonework of the original chapel on the site. So what do we know about the history of the site? Well, not a great deal, to be honest. The late 18th century statistical accounts mention that in 1237, Alexander II gave the charter of Leny to the Buchanan family. But their relationship with Leny appears to have ended in the early 20th century when they sold the estate. This being said, the burial ground appears to have been used well beyond that date and into the 21st century. It's noted as ruined in the mapping of the late 18th century, and here is the OS 1866 map with a rectangular burial enclosure clearly marked, although something's obviously also very clear, and that's the subject of floods written just above it, and the boggy land that the whole site appears to be sitting on, which probably gives us some indication as to why the original church was probably abandoned. So here's the topographic survey of the site, which was completed as part of the works, and we can clearly see the roughly east-west enclosure on the west side, which measures about 19 by 8 metres, and the walls are about 65 centimetres thick. So it's quite a sturdy structure, clearly meant to last a long time. There's a small arched entrance in the south wall, and above that there's a small pediment with a thistle carving inscribed the Buchanan Chapel, 1214. Now this, of course, is a much later written inscription, and the enclosure walls are probably a reuse of the stonework of the old chapel. Now the chapel is probably what we can see to the east here, with the remains of an L-shaped section of wall. The evidence of the reuse of the chapel for the enclosure in part comes from a carved piece of stonework in the southeast corner, the photo to the top right of the slide here, which was possibly taken from the chapel. So what kind of grave markers are we looking at Leny? Well, there's about 21 graves and 7 wall plaques within the enclosure and 29 outside, presuming that the most important Buchanans, of course, were buried within the enclosure. The earliest legible graves appear to be from the 18th century, and there's one wall plaque in the east wall dating to 1724, which you can see to the top left photo here. So we're looking at a possible early 18th century date for this, although exactly when is unclear. For example, this plaque could have been removed from somewhere else and placed here at a later date. But we can go with a roughly firm early 18th century date for when the Buchanans decided to make the burial ground more formal, with a specific structure to house the family in a sort of open mausoleum, as it were. So, looking outside the enclosure, there are 3 more 18th century slabs or tablets set on raised pedestals with a combination of memento mori and heraldic symbology. And I've just put up a few examples here to the right of the slide. As you can see, the carvings are all that really stand out in these graves. And in the inscriptions are only partially legible. They were never really inscribed that deep. Without going into too much detail about the meaning of the inscriptions, which is a whole much wider subject, the skull and crossbones, it's a common early motif, an obvious symbol of death seen on many late 17th and 18th century stones. And it's a literal visual reminder to anyone who looks at the grave that one day it will be you. The surrounding burials, or the ones that we can see at least from outside the enclosure, date to the 19th and 20th century, some grouped and surrounded by iron rails. And finally, one of the more prominent and recent memorials is a granite plaque dedicated to poet Dougal Buchanan, the inscription here at the bottom of the slide. So, moving on. So what about the significance of the burial ground at Leny? And as with Kilmahog, the site is C-listed, which means it's already been legally assigned as being of regional significance. So what are the intrinsic characteristics of Leny? Well, it's clearly, once again, the grave markers, plaques, slabs and gravestones themselves, together with the 18th century Buchanan enclosure and its associated carved stonework and entrance, what is possibly the remains of the original chapel to the east. The lettering of 1214 over the entrance that we saw earlier is very similar to other 18th century inscribed dates on 3 tablets built into the internal walls. So we can state that this was an 18th century memorial to the date of the original church. And of course, the date of the site clearly indicates that there's likely buried archaeology on the site. So contextual characteristics, remember that's looking at the significance of the burial ground and its setting. Basically, Leny is located on a hillock at the confluence of the 2 rivers to the south of Callander, surrounded by mature trees, and the site sometimes floods. According to the statistical accounts, which were written in the 1790s, a major flood in the late 17th century divided 2 parishes when the north branch of the river changed course and the bridge leading into the chapel was swept away. It was clearly at this point that the chapel may well have fallen out of use and a new church was built in Callander. So what can we say about the associative characteristics? Well, clearly we can look at the relationship between the site and the Buchanans of Leny, who really established their burial rights during the 18th century with the building with the enclosure, using what they could of the chapel to adorn it, and also commemorating the church and the inscription above the entrance. Despite the 1214 date inscribed there, we know that the church dates to at least 1238 from known documentary evidence. And of course, as with Kilmahog, the grave markers themselves identify names and details of members of the local community with links to the Buchanan family. And also the Dougal Buchanan Memorial is also an important local connection, commemorated by the granite wall plaque dating to 1995. So a relatively recent addition, albeit 25 years ago. For those of you who don't know, he was an early 18th century poet who wrote in Scots and Scots Gaelic, and he was also a teacher and preacher and a very prominent member in the community at the time. So moving on to the next slide, we can once again look at the specific issues that are affecting Leny in terms of how we can think about preserving and conserving the site. The overall condition of the enclosure boundary wall is generally good, although there's clear evidence of previous remortaring and vegetation growing out of the wall of the entrance. And there are some minor cracks as well. The ironwork's generally quite rusted, and some of the railings around some gravestones are broken, as you can see here, but the majority of the gravestones appear to be in good condition. There's a couple that are leaning, such as this one we can see here in the bottom left, which also incidentally has some very nice detail of its railings surrounding the grave plot. And as with the other sites, some of the grave slabs are partially buried beneath the vegetation. As we can see on the top right photo, you really have to look carefully to see the stone. It's not going to be long before that completely gets engulfed by the grass. So we've had a look at the 3 sites, and we've got an idea of what their heritage assets are, their historical backgrounds, their significance, and also what their main issues are. But just moving back slightly to have another look at significance once again. Now that we've had a look at all 3, what we can't ignore is the group significance that these sites provide, which I've highlighted on this slide here. Now, looking at them as a whole, the surviving architecture and the gravestones, slabs and plaques all add to our knowledge of funerary practice and traditional crafts since the 18th century, and on occasion into the 17th century even. Each burial ground has an association with one or more important people to the area, be it a group such as the Buchanan clan or individuals such as Dougal Buchanan, the McKinley links and the saints themselves, as well as the ordinary people that lived and worked around Callander, the local merchants and craftsmen. Their history is all preserved in these memorials as cultural and social documents. And of course, the memorials and epitaphs are clearly of a more personal importance to descendants. So it's all got a wider and more personal connection. So yes, we can look at these sites individually, but clearly by looking at how close these sites were to each other, they must have had some kind of relationship. And these were only 3 sites. There's many examples of burial grounds similar to these throughout Scotland. Some related to chapels now gone, some related to ruined chapels, which were later turned into burial piles. And this slide here just highlights some in the immediate area that some of you may be familiar with, a full range of sites, all with their own levels of significance and issues. And many of the issues they face in terms of caring for their future are very similar. So now we can turn to what can be done. And this was the reason the plan was undertaken in the first place. We can look to the future and see a way forward to keep these sites from deteriorating, which is something I'm just going to touch on in the next slide. Now, there's been many approaches to conservation in the past. I'm certainly not going to try and go through them all here. It's not really my area of expertise, but presently the minimal intervention approach is generally considered to be the best way to help preserve the important aspects of heritage sites. But of course, some intervention must be done to prevent further decay of these sites and monuments, as the do-nothing approach has a lot of issues itself, which I've briefly listed here. As I may have mentioned earlier, most grave memorials in Scottish burial grounds are constructed from sedimentary or metamorphic stone or sandstones, and especially around Leny and Kilmahog, the local geology is sandstones and siltstones, which suffer a great degree of weathering. Now, this photo to the right here is actually an example from Dunbar over in East Lothian, but it gives you an idea of the type of damage that could potentially happen over time to these kind of stones. You can see that the inscription has been totally destroyed. Another issue here is that the grave markers on these sites are only a fraction of what was originally created. Early medieval markers would have been made of wood and long since perished. Older stones now buried beneath the ground, or even some completely removed to make way for new ones. So the amount of human remains below the ground can't completely be known. And this brings us onto another issue, a much more natural one of grazing and burrowing animals. To give you an idea of the problems you can get, I was part of a team that surveyed a similar but much larger site at Tulloch in Aberdeenshire a few years ago. And the underlying geology was very soft, it was almost sandy. And this meant that it was a huge breeding ground for rabbits. And the problem got so severe that the extensive burrowing was churning up everything below the ground, which, as you can imagine, in a graveyard or burial ground is a huge problem. So it's an issue that has to be addressed. But one of the most important considerations that we have, well, most important considerations, one of them, is that we have to take into account with heritage sites, something that's really being looked into at the moment by a number of organisations, and that's the dreaded climate change. Now, the Callander Landscape Partnership itself has recently completed a study on climate change and heritage, and there's a talk by AOC's Graham Cavers on the subject he did towards the end of last year, which is available on YouTube. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, you can take a look at that talk. I thoroughly recommend it. I'll just touch on it here and emphasise that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. It's a subject that's very much in the forefront of a lot of people's minds, and not least in the heritage sector. So I've just listed a brief overview of the problems that we might face in relation to burial grounds, specifically related to climate change, including the changing of the weather with longer periods of wetting and drying, which can accelerate ground subsidence, for example. And of course, more rain and extreme weather leads to more decay of the sandstone and the historical evidence of the inscription and carved stonework, losing it forever. More extreme weather brings with it damage by flooding, particularly important for the site at Leny, which is located on a floodplain, and also changes in hydrology. That's the presence and movement of water in the soil, which can clearly affect the preservation of archaeological remains. Change in the weather also brings with it ecological changes in vegetation patterns, animals and pests, for example. But while some of the issues may be far off into the future, it's the slow inevitability and returning frequency of these climate change events and issues which mean that it can't really be ignored. So now we've established that clearly leaving the burial grounds to themselves is not an option. We can establish what we can do to make sure that they stay preserved for as long as they can, while still maintaining the minimal intervention conservation ethos. So the first thing to consider in all intervention is that there's already a lot of legislation and policy in place to guide us on this, a very brief list of which is here in the slide, which, as you can see, dates back all the way to the mid-19th century with the Burial Act up to the present day, with various local planning guidance and local council plans. These are all aimed at tackling heritage issues and how conservation and preservation of heritage sites should be approached. There's not enough time to go through all of this, obviously, in one talk, but it's worth mentioning that decisions are based on guidance from many of these sources. And what all this means for our three sites in the first instance is that with the case of St Bride's, which is a scheduled monument, something that's been considered of national importance, scheduled monument consent would be needed to be given by Hess, and clearly any intervention has to be carefully thought out, with initial discussions beforehand with Hess to make sure everyone is on the right track. And they have their own policies and dealing with sites like these that they can bring into the discussion. The two C-listed sites at Kilmahog and Leny would also need listed building consent depending on the scale of the work from the local planning authority. And of course, the landowner has got to be fully engaged and on board with what approaches and interventions are going to be made. This means working with skilled contractors and conservators who have experience working on heritage sites. So we're coming to the end of the talk now, with only a few slides left to let you know what the plan has identified in terms of a range of interventions that could take place based on this conservation approach. And these are fairly standard headings when approaching a plan such as this, and can be defined as immediate, urgent, necessary, and desirable. The words speak for themselves, the immediate category being what really needs to be done now to prevent further damage to the site for health and safety reasons, and to prevent immediate damage. And here we've established that removing and stabling the loose rubble from the collapsed boundary walls is something that really needs to be tackled straight away. Urgent work is perhaps something that really should be done fairly soon to prevent imminent damage. And we've identified that there needs to be some control of the vegetation on the sites, as well as further repairs to the breaks in the boundary walls, whether this means either rebuilding them or consolidating what's left before they can collapse even further. I know that some work in terms of vegetation clearance was done at Leny by the volunteers of the Callander Heritage Society back in 2017, which was of enormous help. But as with so many other things, vegetation grows back and it's an ongoing chore unless a proper plan is in place. And finally, repairing some of the ironwork as well before the rust and decay set in, such as the gates and fixings at Kilmahog. Not surprised, as I've written there. So necessary works, again, something that really needs to be done, although if it isn't done right away, there's not an immediate risk to the sites. And here we're looking at the survey and monitoring of the riverbank. That is, we can get an idea of when we'll be looking at a really bad flood problem, if it's getting worse year by year, for example. Then we can also look at controlling the corrosion and rust of the ironwork. Obviously, there's a lot of guidance on this, as there is in all building conservation techniques. So a solution could be found either repainting or treating the ironwork, which means it can be protected from the elements and prevent any further deterioration, and also selective repointing. We've seen on all three sites that vegetation has caused cracks, occasional small trees or branches growing out of the stonework, so this could lead to major problems further down the line, so it has to be tackled. So what is desirable? Well, all three of the sites are heritage assets, and I've mentioned throughout this talk how valuable these types of sites are in terms of the wider knowledge they can provide about the local area, in terms of wider study, and how much more additional research can be done so that their value is recorded. And there is also the question of accessibility as well. These are important heritage sites on private land, and to make them accessible to the public is also a consideration that should be explored. Now, this can happen in a number of ways, for example, interpretation boards so that visitors can understand and appreciate the sites with better access and pathways. But it's clear that each site poses its own accessibility problems with rough ground, limited car parking, no wheelchair access at all. So we can have a look at how we can create information and visuals online without the need to actually visit the sites, for example. This image here on the bottom right is just one example with an interactive 3D model of an old church and churchyard. So this is my last but one slide, and I apologise for it being very wordy there, but I'd just like to show you the general options presented in the plan, which is basically a conclusion to what I presented in this talk. All decisions made with regard to conservation of these sites takes into account their significance, looking to do like-for-like sympathetic repairs, making sure that everyone is talking to each other, from the funders of the work to the managers of the work, the landowners, HES, the local planning authority, and of course the conservation professionals, architects and masons. Also making sure that what is done is an opportunity for education as well, in both terms of conservation challenges that might arise, but also for the public and how they might benefit from the works. Making a record of everything that's completed, and of course updating the plan, doing regular monitoring of how the work is progressing and what still needs to be done. So rather than end on a little wordy slide, I've just put together a quick chart showing the condition of the graves we found at Kilmahog. And as you can see, almost half the graves were considered to be in a very poor or average condition, with some of the issues highlighted in the photos to the right to give you an idea of the poor quality of some of these monuments and how important it is that we take some action as soon as we can to get some funding together to take more accurate and detailed records of the site, and also allow some conservation to take place to prevent them from deteriorating further. So that's all I have to say on this excellent project at the moment, which I'm sure is only the first step to seeing what we can do to make these really valuable and important burial grounds much improved heritage assets for the future. And of course, I'd like to end by thanking the rest of the AOC team, Leny especially, a senior consultant to AOC, who was instrumental in putting the plan together, as well as Robert Usher and Jamie Humble for carrying out the topographical survey. The Drummock Estate, of course, for allowing access to the sites, and also to Ross and Julie for managing the project on behalf of the Callander Landscape Project. And finally, of course, the funders, the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Historic Environment Support Fund. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening.